Humankind has always stood before death as if standing at the edge of a silent abyss, an abyss that answers no questions yet provokes countless ones. To the observer, death is not only an ending, but a strange mirror in which life suddenly becomes fragile, temporary, and painfully vivid. This awareness has followed humanity like a shadow, shaping everything from belief systems to emotional landscapes. Psychology suggests that death anxiety arises from ancient circuits within the human brain. This internal machinery, designed for survival rather than contemplation, reacts to thoughts of death as if they were immediate physical threats. Even a passing reflection on mortality can trigger a cascade of signals urging the body to defend itself. Though there is nothing to defend against, except an idea, uncertainty deepens this fear. Human beings can adapt to many hardships, but they struggle with what they cannot define. Death remains the ultimate unknown, unmapped and unreachable. Science touches it only at the borders. Religion interprets rather than proves. Philosophy considers but cannot grasp. This uncertainty leaves the mind suspended between curiosity and dread, making death not only a biological ending, but a conceptual puzzle. Attachment adds emotional weight to the fear. People cling to their memories, their relationships, their unfinished dreams, and the identities they spent decades shaping. They build futures in their imaginations and dread the thought of never walking into them. The stronger the attachment, the heavier the anxiety becomes. Death threatens not only physical existence, but the stories individuals tell about themselves. Taken together, instinct, uncertainty, and attachment create a complex emotional web. Yet this web is not a mistake in human design. It is the natural outcome of being a conscious creature who knows both the value of life and the certainty of its end. And from this tension emerges the human search for meaning, a search explored deeply by modern psychology. We sail within a vast sphere, ever drifting in uncertainty. Blaise Pascal. Terror management theory suggests that every culture, identity, and moral system humans create serves a hidden purpose: to shield the mind from the terror of mortality. According to this perspective, humans do not simply live. They construct frameworks that give their lives continuity beyond physical existence. Meaning becomes an internal fortress, allowing the individual to walk through the uncertainty of life without collapsing under its weight. Researchers who developed this theory observed that thoughts of death, even when subtle or subconscious, could influence human behavior in surprising ways. People become more attached to their beliefs, more protective of their identities, and more eager to secure their place in the world. The awareness of impermanence drives them toward permanence, at least in symbolic forms. Yet an interesting paradox arises. Those who avoid thinking about death tend to experience greater fear when the subject inevitably returns. Avoidance amplifies anxiety. Awareness, however, transforms it. When individuals face the fact of their mortality with clarity, they often feel a renewed sense of purpose. Life appears sharper, more urgent, and more meaningful. The ordinary feels precious. This insight suggests that the fear of death is not a barrier to living, but a doorway. When people consciously acknowledge their finite nature, they often act with greater intention, make decisions with more authenticity, and cultivate deeper relationships. Mortality becomes a reminder rather than a threat, urging them to participate fully in the moment instead of drifting through it. From this viewpoint, meaning becomes the antidote to fear. Not meaning in a grand or dramatic sense, but meaning created through daily choices, connections, and creative contributions. Every act that reflects one's values becomes a small form of immortality, an imprint left on the world long after the physical body disappears. In this way, TMT reframes death not as an ending, but as a catalyst for living with purpose. The fear of death is the invisible force behind many of our most visible behaviors. Sheldon Solomon. Epicurus approached the problem of death through logic rather than emotion. He argued that fear of death was irrational because no one ever experiences death itself. When a person is alive, death is absent. When death arrives, the person no longer exists to perceive it. To the observer, this idea suggests that death is not something that happens to consciousness at all, but rather the end of consciousness. Therefore, fearing it is like fearing a dreamless sleep that will never be noticed. The Stoics added another dimension. They viewed death not as an interruption, but as a natural transition within the larger rhythm of existence. Accepting this rhythm brought peace. By contemplating death regularly, they sought not despair, but clarity. Remembering their mortality helped them resist trivial concerns and focus on what truly mattered. Life became more vivid when seen through the lens of its impermanence. Eastern philosophies offered their own perspective. In Buddhism, life and death are not opposites, but continuous movements within a greater cycle. Death is not destruction, but transformation. Suffering arises not from death itself, but from clinging to what must inevitably change. When individuals loosen their grip on attachment, the fear of death shifts into understanding. The end of one form becomes the beginning of another. Modern existentialism embraced mortality as the foundation of authentic living. To philosophers like Heidegger, the awareness of death was not a morbid thought, but the key to living with depth. When a person remembers that time is finite, the illusion of limitless tomorrows dissolves. Decisions become more intentional, values more personal, and life more real. Mortality, in this sense, awakens authenticity. Across these traditions, one theme repeats: fear of death loses its power when death is integrated into one's worldview instead of treated as an intruder. When humans understand their place in the cycle of nature or the structure of meaning, death becomes less of an enemy and more of a boundary that gives shape to life. It is not death that a man should fear, but never beginning to live. Marcus Aurelius. Modern psychology offers practical tools to reshape the emotional response to mortality. One of the most effective is gentle mental exposure. Instead of avoiding the topic of death, individuals are encouraged to explore it through reading, reflection, or conversation. Over time, the mind becomes less reactive, learning that thoughts of death are not threats but concepts to be examined. Fear softens when the unknown becomes familiar. Another method involves identifying unfinished aspects of life. People often fear death not because of death itself, but because of what they believe they have not yet done. Writing down these unfinished intentions, relationships to mend, goals to pursue, experiences to seek, creates a roadmap for living more deliberately. When these parts of life begin to close or progress, the mind feels less burdened by what might have been. Meaning-based therapy emphasizes strengthening personal values and building a life aligned with them. Purpose reduces fear because it gives the mind a reason to accept the finality of existence. When individuals act in ways that reflect who they are and what they care about, death becomes less threatening. Their lives, in a sense, feel complete, even if time remains uncertain. Physical techniques also play a role. Thoughts of death often trigger bodily reactions, such as tension or rapid breathing. Practices like deep breathing, meditation, or body scanning help regulate these responses. The calmer the body becomes, the more clearly the mind can approach the subject. This physiological shift creates space for reflection instead of panic. Together, these strategies show that the fear of death can be managed through awareness, meaning, and intentional living. Mortality remains a fact, but its emotional weight becomes lighter. When people live with clarity and alignment, the boundary at the end of life feels less like a threat and more like a natural closing of a well-lived story. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates. If death is the final chapter of every story, then fear of death is merely the silence before the last page turns. It is not an enemy, but a reminder that life is temporary and therefore precious. The observer who recognizes this truth begins to see life not as a race against time, but as a journey shaped by choices, relationships, and meaning. When mortality becomes part of one's awareness rather than a distant dread, every moment gains depth. Time no longer slips by unnoticed. Conversations matter more, small joys grow brighter. The present stops feeling like a bridge to the future and becomes the place where life actually happens. And in this shift, fear slowly loses its voice. Philosophy, psychology, and spirituality all agree on one point. Death does not diminish life, it defines it. Without an ending, stories lose their shape. Without mortality, the human experience loses urgency and purpose. The boundary of life gives meaning to everything that takes place within it. Recognizing this transforms fear into understanding. This journey toward acceptance, clarity, and purpose is available to anyone who chooses to take it. It begins with reflection, continues with intention, and unfolds through action. A meaningful life does not require perfection. It requires awareness. And awareness is something each person can cultivate, one day at a time. For those watching this video, the invitation is simple. Explore these ideas, reflect on your own meaning, and shape your life in a way that would make your final chapter feel complete. If this message resonated, consider subscribing, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and joining future discussions on philosophy, psychology, and the hidden architecture of the human mind.